On March 26, 2018, at the Shanghai International Energy Exchange, a new futures contract began trading. It was for crude oil, priced not in US dollars but in Chinese yuan. The launch was quiet, almost ceremonial. There were no dramatic speeches, no grand declarations. The Western financial press barely noticed. A few analysts mentioned it in passing, dismissing it as a symbolic gesture with little practical importance. But the people who understood what was happening, the central bankers, the commodity traders, the geopolitical strategists, they knew they were witnessing a historic moment. For the first time since the 1970s, there was a viable alternative mechanism for trading oil outside the dollar system. It was the culmination of a strategy that China had been executing patiently, methodically, for over 2 decades. A strategy to build a parallel financial system, piece by piece, institution by institution, currency swap by currency swap, until one day the world would wake up and realize that the dollar was no longer indispensable. That day is coming sooner than anyone in Washington wants to admit. To understand how China is replacing the dollar, you have to understand why they want to. The story begins not in Beijing, but in Washington. In the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, China watched in horror as the American financial system nearly collapsed, taking the global economy down with it. China held over $1 trillion in U.S. Treasury bonds at the time. Those bonds represented decades of Chinese labor, millions of workers in factories making toys, electronics, and clothing for American consumers. And in a matter of weeks, as America printed trillions of dollars to bail out its banks, the value of those Chinese holdings was being quietly eroded. The Chinese leadership felt trapped. They had lent their wealth to America, and America was repaying them with depreciated dollars. But they couldn't sell their treasury bonds because dumping them would crash the market, destroying the value of what remained. They were hostages to a system they didn't control. And then came the real wake-up call. In the years after 2008, America began using the dollar as a weapon. When Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, the U.S. cut Russian banks off from the dollar system, crippling their economy. When Iran refused to abandon its nuclear program, the U.S. imposed sanctions that prevented Iranian banks from accessing international finance. When Venezuela defied American interests, the U.S. froze billions in Venezuelan assets held in American banks. The Chinese watched all of this and drew a conclusion. The dollar is not just a currency. It's a tool of American power. And as long as China's economy depends on dollars, China is vulnerable. If China ever came into serious conflict with the United States, America could do to China what it did to Russia and Iran. It could freeze Chinese assets, cut Chinese banks off from the international payment system, and strangle the Chinese economy without firing a single shot. This was unacceptable. China is not some small country that can be bullied. It's the world's second largest economy, the largest exporter, the largest manufacturer. It has 1.4 billion people and a government that thinks in terms of centuries, not election cycles. And that government made a decision. China would build an alternative to the dollar system. It would take decades. It would require enormous resources and patience. But it would be done because the alternative, remaining dependent on American financial infrastructure, was a strategic vulnerability that China could not tolerate. The plan had several components, each designed to chip away at different aspects of dollar dominance. And the execution began quietly, in ways that seemed innocuous at the time, but were actually building the foundation for a post-dollar world. The first component was bilateral currency swaps. Starting in 2009, China began signing agreements with other countries to trade directly in their own currencies, bypassing the dollar entirely. The first swap was with Argentina. Then came Belarus, then Iceland, then Indonesia. One by one, country by country, China built a network of agreements that allowed trade to be settled in yuan instead of dollars. The agreements were structured simply. If a Brazilian company wanted to buy Chinese machinery, instead of converting Brazilian reals to dollars and then dollars to yuan, they could convert reals directly to yuan. The transactions would be settled through the central banks of both countries, which would maintain currency swap lines. This might sound technical and boring, but it was revolutionary. For decades, the dollar had been the necessary intermediary in almost all international trade. If Nigeria wanted to buy oil from Saudi Arabia, the transaction went through dollars. If Japan wanted to buy wine from France, it went through dollars. The dollar was the middleman, collecting a fee on every transaction, and more importantly, giving America visibility and control over global commerce. China's swap agreements were creating alternative pathways that cut the dollar out. By 2023, China had signed currency swap agreements with over 40 countries representing more than half the world's population. These weren't just symbolic pieces of paper. They were being used. In 2010, less than 1% of Chinese trade was settled in yuan. By 2023, over 30% was settled in yuan. That's trillions of dollars of trade that no longer flows through the American financial system. The second component was creating alternative institutions. The existing global financial architecture, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, were all dominated by the United States and its allies. China had little influence in these institutions despite being a major economic power, so China decided to build its own. In 2014, China established the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, or IB. It was pitched as a development bank to finance roads, bridges, and ports across Asia. 57 countries joined as founding members, including American allies like Britain, Germany, and Australia, despite Washington's objections. The AIIB had $100 billion in capital, making it a serious competitor to the World Bank. But the real significance wasn't the money. It was the signal. Countries were willing to join a Chinese-led institution even when America opposed it. The dollar's gravitational pull was weakening. Then came the new development bank, created by the BRICS nations: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Another institution, another alternative, another brick in the wall. But the most important institution China built was CIPS, the cross-border interbank payment system. This requires some explanation because it's technical but absolutely crucial. The dollar's dominance is enforced through a system called SWIFT, the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication. SWIFT is a messaging network that banks use to send payment instructions to each other. If a bank in Tokyo wants to send money to a bank in London, they use SWIFT to communicate. Almost every international bank in the world uses SWIFT, and SWIFT is controlled by a consortium based in Belgium but heavily influenced by the United States. This is the choke point. When America wants to sanction a country, it pressures SWIFT to cut that country's banks off from the network. Without access to SWIFT, a bank can't send or receive international payments. It's essentially expelled from the global financial system. This is the weapon America used against Russia, Iran, and North Korea. And this is the weapon China is most vulnerable to. If the US ever cut Chinese banks off from SWIFT, the Chinese economy would be. So China built CIPS as an alternative, launched in 2015. CIPS is China's own international payment system. It allows banks around the world to send yuan-denominated payments without using SWIFT. Initially, it was small and slow. Most banks stuck with SWIFT because that's where the liquidity was. But China was patient. They gradually upgraded the system, added participants, and improved functionality. By 2023, CIPS was processing over 80 trillion yuan per year, equivalent to over $12 trillion. It's still smaller than SWIFT, which processes far more, but CIPS is growing fast. And crucially, it exists. If America ever tried to weaponize SWIFT against China, China has an escape hatch. And so do China's trading partners. The third component was the petroleum. This is where the strategy gets really clever. The US dollar became the global reserve currency partly because of the petrodollar system. In the 1970s, America made a deal with Saudi Arabia and other oil producers. They would price oil in dollars, and in return, America would provide military protection. This meant every country that needed oil, which is every country, needed dollars. It created permanent global demand for dollars, which allowed America to run trade deficits and print money without consequences. China wanted to replicate this system with yuan, but oil producers were reluctant to accept yuan because the yuan was unfreely convertible in China's financial markets were UND or liquid. So China got creative. They created a mechanism where oil exporters could accept yuan for oil and then immediately convert those yuan into gold on the Shanghai Gold Exchange. Essentially, China was offering gold-backed yuan for oil. This solved the convertibility problem. Saudi Arabia or Russia could sell oil to China for yuan, then turn those yuan into gold if they didn't want to hold Chinese currency. It was brilliant, and it's working. In 2023, Saudi Arabia, America's most important Middle Eastern ally, announced it was open to selling oil to China in yuan. Russia cut off from dollars by sanctions, began selling most of its oil to China in yuan. Iran and Venezuela also did the same. The United Arab Emirates and Brazil began accepting yuan for oil sales to China. The petrodollar monopoly was breaking, but China didn't stop there. The fourth component was the Belt and Road Initiative, the most ambitious infrastructure project in human history. Starting in 2013, China began lending hundreds of billions of dollars to developing countries to build ports, railways, highways, and power plants. Over 150 countries signed up. The projects were financed with Chinese loans, built by Chinese companies, using Chinese materials, and the loans were denominated in yuan. This created a web of debt that tied these countries to China's economy and China's currency. A country that borrows yuan to build a Chinese-financed port will naturally do more trade with China in yuan. The Belt and Road Initiative wasn't charity. It was a strategic investment in building a yuan-denominated economic sphere. Critics in the West called it debt trap diplomacy, arguing that China was deliberately lending to countries that couldn't repay, then seizing assets when they There's some truth to this. Sri Lanka defaulted on Chinese loans and had to lease a strategic port to China for 99 years. But China's goals weren't just about seizing assets. They were about creating dependency, about making the yuan indispensable to more and more countries. Countries from Pakistan to Kenya to Serbia are increasingly integrated into China's economic orbit, conducting trade in yuan, borrowing in yuan, and holding yuan reserves. The fifth component was buying gold. Lots of gold. Since 2008, China has been quietly, relentlessly buying physical gold. The People's Bank of China reports holding about 2,000 tons of gold in its reserves. But independent analysts believe the real number is much higher, possibly 4,000 to 6,000 tons, because China doesn't report all its purchases. Why does this matter? Because gold is the ultimate reserve asset. It's trusted universally, accepted everywhere, and can't be printed by any government. By accumulating gold, China is building a buffer against dollar devaluation. More importantly, gold gives the yuan credibility. A currency backed by gold, even partially, is more attractive than a pure fiat currency backed by nothing. China learned this lesson from history. The British pound was trusted because it was backed by gold. When Britain abandoned the gold standard, the pound lost its status. The dollar was trusted because it was backed by gold under Bretton Woods. When Nixon closed the gold window, the dollar should have lost its status, but there was no alternative. China is positioning the yuan as the alternative, backed by gold, backed by the world's largest manufacturing economy, and backed by a payment system that doesn't require American permission. Now, here's where all these components come together. Individually, each one seems incremental, not threatening to dollar dominance. Currency swaps are just bilateral agreements. The AIIB is just another development bank. CIPS is just a payment system. The petroleum is still small compared to the Belt and Road Initiative is just infrastructure lending. The gold purchases are just diversification. But together, they form a comprehensive alternative ecosystem. A country that wants to reduce its dollar dependence now has options. It can trade with China in yuan using a currency swap. It can borrow from the AIIB instead of the IMF. It can use CIPs for payments instead of SWIFT. It can sell oil to China for yuan and convert to gold. It can join Belt and Road projects financed in yuan. It can hold gold and yuan reserves instead of dollars. The infrastructure for a post-dollar world is being built, and it's not theoretical. It's being used right now. In 2023, China surpassed the United States in total trade volume with more countries than America trades with. And increasingly, that trade is conducted in yuan, not dollars. The implications are staggering. For 80 years, America has enjoyed what French economists call the exorbitant privilege. Because the dollar is the reserve currency, America can print money and buy real goods from other countries. It can run massive trade deficits without consequences. It can impose sanctions and control global finance. This privilege has allowed America to live far beyond its means, to maintain a military that costs more than the next 10 countries combined, to offer a standard of living based on consumption rather than production. But this privilege depends on one thing: everyone else continuing to use and trust the dollar, and that trust is eroding. Every time America freezes a country's assets, every time it uses SWIFT as a weapon, every time it prints trillions of dollars to bail out banks or finance deficits, countries ask themselves a question. Do we really want to be dependent on a system controlled by a country that uses it to advance its own interests, that weaponizes it against its enemies, that prints unlimited amounts whenever it has domestic problems? China is offering an alternative answer. You don't have to be dependent on America. You can trade with us in yuan. You can use our payment systems. You can borrow from our banks. You can hold your reserves in our currency and gold. We won't freeze your assets. We won't sanction you for political reasons. It's a compelling pitch, especially for countries that have been on the receiving end of American sanctions or pressure. But China faces enormous challenges in replacing the dollar. The yuan is still not freely convertible. China maintains capital controls that prevent money from flowing freely in and out of the country. This is a deliberate choice. China remembers the Asian financial crisis of 1997, when hot money flowing in and out of countries caused devastating instability. They don't want to be vulnerable to speculative attacks, but capital controls make investors nervous. Until China removes these controls, the yuan will never be fully trusted as a reserve currency. China's financial markets are also not transparent. The rule of law is weak. The Chinese Communist Party can change regulations arbitrarily. Companies can be shut down for political reasons. Foreign investors have no real legal protections. This makes China a risky place to park your wealth. These are legitimate concerns, and the main reasons why the yuan is still only about 3% of global reserves compared to over 60% for the dollar. China has a long way to go. But here's the thing. China doesn't need to fully replace the dollar. It just needs to create enough of an alternative that the dollar's monopoly is broken. If the yuan becomes even 15 or 20% of global reserves, if 30 or 40% of international trade is conducted in yuan instead of dollars, the dynamics change completely. America loses its exorbitant privilege. It can no longer print unlimited dollars without consequences. It can no longer weaponize the financial system without pushing more countries toward alternatives. And that's exactly the trajectory we're on. The dollar's share of global reserves has been declining steadily. In 2001, it was 73%. In 2023, it was 59% and falling. The yuan's share has been rising from essentially zero in 2010 to over 3% in 2023. That might not sound like much, but the trend is clear and the trend is accelerating. Every time America uses sanctions, more countries diversify away from dollars. Every time the Federal Reserve prints money, more central banks buy gold and yuan. Every time China offers a currency swap or launches a new institution, the alternative system grows stronger. The Western sanctions on Russia after the Ukraine invasion were a wake-up call for the entire developing world. Countries from India to Saudi Arabia to Brazil saw what America was willing to do, freezing hundreds of billions in Russian central bank reserves, cutting Russia off from SWIFT, seizing assets. These countries asked themselves, could this happen to us? And they realized the answer was yes. If they ever came into conflict with the United States, their dollar reserves could be frozen, their banks could be cut off, their economies could be... This is intolerable for any sovereign nation, and it's pushing them toward China's alternative system. The most significant shift came from Saudi Arabia. For 50 years, Saudi Arabia had been America's most important ally in the Middle East. The petrodollar system was built on the Saudi-American relationship. But in 2023, Saudi Arabia announced it was joining the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, a Chinese-led political and economic bloc. It began accepting yuan for oil sales to China. It started conducting joint military exercises with China. It even brokered a peace deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia with Chinese mediation, sidelining America. This was unthinkable 5 years ago. But it's happening because Saudi Arabia sees which way the wind is blowing. China is now Saudi Arabia's largest customer for oil. China has money and hunger for resources. America is increasingly self-sufficient in energy and less interested in the Middle East. The strategic calculus has shifted, and if Saudi Arabia, the linchpin of the petrodollar system, is moving toward China, the entire architecture is crumbling. The lesson from history is clear. Reserve currency status is not permanent. The Spanish silver dollar dominated for 2 centuries, then disappeared. The British pound dominated for a century, then lost its status in just 2 decades after World War II. The transitions happen when 3 conditions are met. First, the issuing country loses economic dominance. Second, The issuing country abuses the privilege by printing too much money or weaponizing the currency. Third, a viable alternative emerges. All three conditions are being met right now. America's share of global GDP is shrinking. The dollar is being weaponized against more countries every year, and China has built a viable alternative infrastructure. The transition won't happen overnight. It will take years, possibly decades, but the direction is clear. The dollar's monopoly is ending. The yuan won't replace it entirely. The future will likely be multipolar, with several reserve currencies and payment systems. But China will be at the center of that new system, and America will lose the exorbitant privilege that has funded its lifestyle and its empire for 80 years. When that happens, the consequences for ordinary Americans will be severe. The trade deficits will matter. The debt will matter. The prices of imports will soar. The standard of living will fall. America will have to produce what it consumes instead of printing money to buy it from others. It will be a painful adjustment, made worse by the fact that most Americans don't see it coming. They believe dollar dominance is eternal, that America's financial power is unshakable. They're wrong, and the people building the alternative system in Beijing are counting on that ignorance. They're building quietly, patiently, brick by brick. And by the time Washington realizes what's happened, it will be too late to stop it. I'm Adam, and this is the Prime History Tales channel. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve, because when the history books are written, you'll want to be among the few who saw it.